it's old news by now. We know that at their June meeting, the Reserve Bank of Australia dropped their official interest rates to 1.25%. As much has been said about it already has been said, but in today's Property Insider chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, I'd like to look at a different angle. You see, most of us hear about the Reserve Bank of Australia, and we know it makes an interest rate decision on the first Tuesday, 11 months of the year. But what does the Reserve Bank actually do? What are their aims? How do they achieve them? So let's delve into this and see why they've cut the rates. So welcome, Andrew Wilson. Good to have you.
Thank you, Michael Yardney.
So, Andrew, first some background. As was widely expected, the Reserve Bank of Australia cut their rates. It's the first official interest rate cut since August 2016, but it's actually the 13th cut in this interest rate cycle. It started back in November 2011 when, thinking back then, rates were 4.75%. Now, it's not a new rate cutting cycle, unusual, because normally after a few rate cuts, the economy picks up, inflation picks up, wages grows, our property markets go. They're all stimulated by the lower interest rates, and that leads to the next phase of interest rates moving up. That didn't happen this time, Andrew. In fact, it's the longest easing cycle on record, and many banks have actually cut the rates a bit, so it's brought the interest rates to the lowest since 1950. Andrew, I remember over the last few years, there were other people suggesting interest rates would rise, but you were the first economist I heard forecasting a couple of years ago that there was going to be a fall in interest rates next. What did you see that the others didn't see?
Well, I think it was really the fact that there wasn't anything happening, Michael, and that was just in Australia. But this has become a macroeconomic conundrum that we haven't seen the stimulus or the inflation from monetary policy that we've seen, as you suggested, in previous cycles. So monetary policy hasn't followed the rule book. Macroeconomics hasn't followed the rule book. And of course, central banks have been scratching their head to figure out, well, why has this happened? Now, as long as we saw income growth low, and that would have meant, and that always keeps inflation low, and there was no sign of that budging, despite strong employment growth, we were always in this new world of difference in terms of the effect of monetary policy on our macro economy. And the only way forward for Australia would have been another cut, particularly given that we held our rates for so long, and particularly given our rates were so far ahead of the rest of the world at that stage. So it meant that A, something has changed, and it meant B, clearly that we would need more stimulus down the track.
You've bandied around a number of terms, so let's make a couple of things clear. Monetary policy is what central banks like the Reserve Bank, the Fed, does to protect and guide their economies. It's different from fiscal policy, which is what governments do to affect the economy. Clearly, both are necessary. Monetary policy, fiscal policy stimulates the economy in the short term. What's more valuable, what's more useful at a time like this when our economy is faltering and languishing?
Well, we need a mixed approach, of course, Michael, and it depends on local factors. As I've said, Australia has had and still has, by and large, the highest interest rates in terms of similar advanced economies. So it gives it some flexibility in terms of easing without creating significant issues with the dollar. Of course, that's one of the old systems of when an economy gets into trouble, they cut interest rates, which acts to push down their dollar or their currency, which then increases their competitiveness in terms of trade. But so therefore they start to become more fruitful in their exporting industries. But the offset to that, of course, is that imports become more expensive in the short term. So there's always this adjustment process between an improved export performance and more expensive inflation creating imports, which all acts to lower the cost of living. So there's a price to pay to this. And it's also, of course, fiscal policy, which is government spending. Monetary policy is the price of money, either higher or lower. And the fiscal policy is government spending.
Such as reducing income tax, giving incentives, spending.
And infrastructure projects. The capacity that you have, similar to monetary policy, to stimulate your economy with fiscal policy depends on the state of your budget. Now, obviously, if you're in a significant budget deficit, you are restricted from how much you can stimulate the economy with government spending. Not because you could spend whatever you like, really, just go into debt. the point is the price to pay for that would be higher interest rates. So your extensive spending through a large budget deficit would only lead to higher interest rates, which again, it would be a negative because you were trying to match that fiscal policy with lower rates. So these things are never simple, but I think a balanced approach is the way to go.
Okay, let's have a quick look at what the Reserve Bank does. I want to go through a few things quickly, and then there's a few questions I'd like to ask you. But most people don't really know what the Reserve Bank does. It's not a real bank. You can't put money in or borrow it out, unless you're the government, I guess. But first of all, it prints money. Interestingly, the Reserve Bank was the first currency issuer in the world to issue plastic notes, I learned. And its job is to design, print, issue the circulating currency and just to destroy the old banknotes. It oversees the payment system. That's the computerized system that the banks use to pay each other to ensure that customers from different banks get paid. It's a non-cash transfer between banks. Clearly, it's acting as the regulator bank. It's the government's banker, so that if you get a tax refund, you get it with the Reserve Bank check. Its job is to promote financial stability, and together with APRA, its job has been to promote Australia's financial stability. You and I have spoken on a couple of these shows about how maybe it hasn't done it as well as it like. It got unintended consequences, but it warns the general public of economic risks. The Reserve Bank has regular statements, speeches, reports, and advises government regulators and people like you and me what's going on. But the big one that keeps coming up in the news and in the media, Andrew, is its job to target inflation. The basis its monetary policy, as I understand, is to target inflation, and that started doing that since 1996. It seems to be the opinion of the Reserve Bank is to target the CPI to keep it stable, to keep the currency stable, to maintain full employment, and to give economic prosperity. And it believes that to do that, you should target CPI of, I guess, between 2 and 3% on average over a cycle, over time.
Well, where do you start on average?
But that's the trouble. It's been saying that for a while. It hasn't been able to do that, Andrew. Obviously, the Reserve Bank is targeting inflation between 2 to 3%, but that's an old target. Is it still appropriate today? Because what it's doing is lowering the cash rate, which has its own consequences.
Well, this is my point about ideology, Michael. It's just a number. Why is it such a special number? Why do we expect that to always be the case? I mean, is human nature such that all its buying and selling decisions to corporations, enterprises and governments all do the same thing year in, year out, decade in, decade out? Of course they don't. Things change. Technology changes. The social environment changes. The political environment changes. And we shouldn't have fixed numbers. Economics is not a statue. It's a living thing in a sense. It reflects the human condition. And this is why we haven't met the inflation target for years now. If you want to think outside the square, perhaps we should have an incomes target. I mean, to me, inflation is always a following outcome for incomes. And that's been why we haven't had an inflation growth, is because we haven't had incomes growth. People can't spend, can't create the consumption to create more output from enterprises that then put up their prices to cover extra wages because they have to compete for staff. It's the old theory. And of course, it makes a lot of sense and it's worked beforehand. But just because it's worked basically for 4 decades doesn't mean it'll hold or bear fruit forever. And it's what's happened now. Now, I don't, hold any particular grudge against the policymakers at the Reserve Bank per se. They have to follow some sort of historical evidence for their policies. This is very serious stuff. They can't be just like, oh, well, this is all new. Let's try something new. No, but certainly after a period of time when it becomes evident, in which it has, that the system isn't working, they've got to try something else in terms of getting the economy to work again. You sort of said, Michael, about the current cycle of interest rates has actually been a long-term easing cycle. Actually, we've had a little bit of interference in that easing cycle, and it's probably been a lot shorter term than we sort of realised, because this time the banks and the regulator haven't played ball with official monetary policy, because even though we had rates on hold, we saw those APRA-initiated policies that acted to push up interest rates sharply for investors twice, and also acted to push up interest rates for owner-occupiers. So we've actually had 2 or 3 rises in the last 3 years of interest rates where they count, and that's as a mortgage rate.
There's two questions that come out of what you just said, Andrew. The first one is, what's wrong with low inflation anyway?
Well, nothing, Michael. I mean, isn't that an ideal world? So it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, it's what real wages are or real wages growth is. And that's what we're all aiming for. A low inflation is a great thing if we have appropriate higher incomes which are producing prosperity. And the prosperity effect is the gap between inflation and incomes. And that's very narrow now. It was quite wide during the previous mining boom. And we were all doing pretty well then, Michael, because we had that capacity to pay for everything we needed to, plus have a little bit left over. Now it's very concerning that not only hardly any gap between inflation, which is low, and incomes growth, which is low, but also we're seeing people delving into their savings now just to survive. And the savings ratio is at near record levels. And that's very concerning.
So the second question that comes out of what you were saying is, will the rate cuts actually help?
Well, they'll certainly help confidence, Michael. I think that will help now ease that negativity that's been really the issue that's driven our housing markets downwards since spring last year. We can now see that those predictions of 40% fall in house prices. I'm not sure how a media outlet could even publish something as ridiculous as that. But anyway, they did. And of course, it worked its way into...
One of the things that's very likely to occur as cash rates fall is people are going to say, well, should the Reserve Bank use quantitative easing? That's what other banks did overseas, other reserve banks. They printed money to buy bonds to inject cash into the economy. Do you think that would help us get going?
Well, it means that the government, in a sense, becomes a debtor to the economy. And the problem with that is that quantitative easing works when monetary policy is failed. I mean, it's an armed monetary policy, but when interest rate cuts haven't created any outcome, then you turn to vaudeville, which is print the money. But the point is you're actually holding money there as a resource for the economy, which at some stage has to be paid back. And that usually works when the economy starts to improve. Now, the US has had some problems with very strong quantitative easing they undertook a few years back with low interest rates weren't doing much at all. And one of their issues is that they needed to get the bonds out of the system, in a sense, to retract that quantitative easing stimulus. I don't even think it works in the worst of circumstances, to be quite honest. It's something that has to be paid back eventually. And that's what the US have sort of found out.
Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. I think it's been fun chatting about the Reserve Bank. Yes. It's easy to point fingers at these people who are paid a lot more than you and I get paid after our country. And I guess they're doing it with the best intentions and from the outside. So let's hope we've educated our viewers, our listeners in this a little bit so they understand a bit more about what the Reserve Bank does, what some of those terms mean, why they made those decisions with the best intentions. I look forward to chatting with you again next week, Andrew.
Well, just before I go, Michael, I just want to emphasise that we clearly, in my opinion, have the best economy in the world. And we also have, in my opinion, the best housing market in the world. So I guess if we aspire to keep that ticking over at its optimum, both the economy and the housing market, that's a good thing. So I'm not negative in terms of our relative position in the rest of the world, but certainly we have challenges as the rest of the world has challenges. But I'd rather be in Australia facing those challenges, Michael, than anywhere else in the world. And I'd rather be an Australian homeowner or investor than anywhere else in the world. And I've said that for many years. And I think the history has proven that to be correct. So let's not get too down on everything, but know that there's some work to be done ahead.
I think that's a fantastic way of finishing off. We're living in the best country in the world.
Yes.
To be honest, at the best time in history. We are very, very lucky that our parents brought us up here or brought us here from other countries, as a lot of our parents did. We could be in a lot worse places, Andrew.
Absolutely.